Hey guys, tonight we wander back to a time when vast forests stretched endlessly, rivers carved mysterious paths, and the land hummed with the quiet power of ancient peoples. You trudge through dense woods alongside native hunters, their footsteps barely rustling fallen leaves, while across the horizon, strange ships loom with sails billowing like ghostly shadows. This is the moment when two worlds, one deeply rooted in nature and tradition, the other driven by ambition and curiosity, first collided. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is locally. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in the early 1500s, standing on the edge of what Europeans called the New World. But for thousands of years before, this land belonged to the Native American tribes. Diverse, complex societies, thriving with rich traditions, languages, and histories. The Lenape, Powhatan, Iroquois, and countless others hunted, farmed, and lived in close harmony with the land. You can almost smell the smoke from campfires, hear the distant drum beats signaling a tribal gathering, and feel the cool river mist settling in the dawn light. Then came the Europeans, first explorers like Giovanni Caboto, known as John Cabot, and later more determined settlers. Their arrival was far from the peaceful handshake of friendship often romanticized today. Instead, it set the stage for immediate misunderstandings and conflicts. Language barriers, cultural differences, and competition for resources fueled tensions. The natives watched warily as these pale-faced strangers brought unfamiliar weapons, diseases, and ideas. The Europeans, meanwhile, were desperate to establish footholds and secure wealth in a land that seemed endless. Historians still argue whether initial conflicts were inevitable due to these differences, or if peaceful coexistence might have been possible with better communication and respect. What we do know is that early skirmishes, whether over hunting grounds, food supplies, or simple mistrust, soon escalated, leaving scars on both sides. For example, the clash at Roanoke Island, the infamous Lost Colony, remains shrouded in mystery but hints at the fragile relations between English settlers and native tribes. And then there were smaller confrontations, raids, thefts, retaliations, that simmered beneath the surface like an unpredictable fire. These early struggles shaped the uneasy dance of diplomacy and violence that would mark the centuries to come. On a quirkier note, some tribes reportedly tried to mimic European technology, fashioning crude firearms from scraps, though accuracy and reliability were questionable at best. Imagine firing a homemade gun only to have it fizzle like a damp sparkler. So, as you settle in, remember that this first contact was not a neat historical event, but a messy, complex beginning full of hope, fear, and conflict. Keep that image of smoke rising from dense forest and the tension hanging thick in the air as we step further into the tangled web of early wars and conflicts. As you push deeper into this sprawling continent, you soon realize the early 1600s are a time of shifting loyalties and power struggles, where European colonial ambitions play out like a high-stakes game of chess. The English and the French, both hungry for control over the vast and resource-rich lands of North America, stake their claims with fortresses, trading posts, and settlements. You trudge along the muddy banks of the St. Lawrence River, where French fur traders negotiate deals with local tribes, their accents thick and their spirits bold. Meanwhile, English settlers cluster along the Atlantic coast, building Jamestown and Plymouth, their wooden palisades reaching skyward in a fragile show of permanence. The Anglo-French rivalry isn't just about land, it's about influence, trade routes, and the future of an entire continent. Both powers cultivate alliances with Native American tribes, who themselves become players in this unfolding drama. The French, with their fur trade networks, tend to forge closer ties with tribes like the Huron and Algonquin. The English, more focused on agricultural colonies, often clash with tribes in the northeast like the Wampanoag and the Powhatan Confederacy. You can almost taste the tension in the air like a storm ready to break. Small skirmishes flare as these colonial powers test each other's resolve and boundaries. The English fortify their settlements. The French send soldiers and missionaries to strengthen their claims. The land becomes a chessboard with pawns, knights, and bishops moving in shadows and whispers. Historians still argue whether this rivalry was destined to explode into full-scale wars, or if more diplomatic skill could have averted decades of bloodshed. What is clear is that the competition created a volatile environment, where every alliance and betrayal shifted the fragile balance of power. In a fun yet peculiar aside, the French sometimes employed Native American warriors not just as allies, but as scouts, who blended stealth with deadly precision. Imagine being tracked through dense forests by a group of expert trackers dressed half in native attire, half in European gear. It was a curious blend of cultures and tactics that both sides exploited. So as you walk along these contested shores and dense woodlands, remember that this period set the tone for many years of conflict, with European ambition and native resilience locked in a tense and uneasy embrace. The battles to come would not just decide land ownership, but the very fate of cultures, peoples, and empires on this vast and wild continent. You find yourself wandering through the dense forests and winding rivers where the indigenous peoples of North America live vibrant and diverse lives, long before and during the European incursions. It's a patchwork of cultures, languages, and alliances, some long-standing, others newly forged in response to the shifting political landscape. Native tribes are not a monolith. They are as varied as the land itself. And as the Europeans arrive, these tribes face difficult decisions, whether to ally with one colonial power, resist both, or attempt to preserve their independence. Some tribes, like the Iroquois Confederacy, master the art of diplomacy and warfare alike, carefully balancing relationships with the English and French to their advantage. You can hear the echoes of their council fires, where leaders debate fiercely the best course for their people. Meanwhile, others, like the Powhatan and the Chesapeake region, struggle with encroaching settlers and the devastating effects of new diseases. Historians still argue whether Native American tribes were more empowered by their alliances with Europeans or ultimately manipulated and weakened by them. The truth is tangled in the smoke of countless negotiations, broken promises, and bloody battles. Some tribes gained new weapons and trading opportunities. Others were devastated by warfare and displacement. A quirky detail: certain tribes adapted European goods in surprising ways, like using glass beads, originally decorative trinkets, as currency, or creating elaborate feathered headdresses combined with metal ornaments, blending old and new in a unique cultural fusion. Imagine trading a handful of colorful beads for a prized hunting rifle, one small object representing an enormous shift in power dynamics. As you walk through these shifting alliances, you notice how the native people's resilience shines through. Their knowledge of the land and strategic prowess often kept them one step ahead of even the most seasoned European soldiers. But this delicate balance was fragile, and the choices tribes made could mean survival or ruin. Remember the lessons from this. Not all wars are fought with muskets and cannons. Sometimes they are fought with words, alliances, and the ever-shifting trust between peoples trying to navigate a rapidly changing world. You move deeper into the tangled forests and frozen rivers where the fur trade isn't just business, it's war. The Beaver Wars, as they came to be called, were a series of violent conflicts in the 17th century, sparked by the soaring demand for beaver pelts in Europe. Picture thick pelts, soft and waterproof, prized in fashion capitals thousands of miles away. This demand made fur the currency of power in North America, turning the continent's wildlife into a battleground. The Iroquois Confederacy, eager to dominate the fur trade, expanded aggressively, clashing with neighboring tribes like the Huron and Algonquin, who were allied with the French. These wars weren't your typical pitched battles. They were swift raids, brutal ambushes, and relentless campaigns that reshaped tribal territories and allegiances. The forests echoed with war cries and the crack of muskets, while European traders watched anxiously, knowing their fortunes depended on these deadly contests. Historians still argue whether the Beaver Wars were more about survival, economic competition, or the fallout from European colonization. One thing is clear: the wars devastated many indigenous communities and altered the social fabric of the region profoundly. On a stranger note, some accounts mention the use of psychological warfare. Warriors would paint their bodies in terrifying patterns and use loud, eerie war cries to unnerve opponents. Imagine creeping through the woods and suddenly facing a ghostly figure painted in red and black, howling into the night. It's no wonder these tactics could cause panic. You might chuckle to know that during these conflicts, some European traders tried to mediate peace by offering peace medals, shiny tokens meant to symbolize goodwill, but they often ended up being trinkets tossed aside in the heat of battle. Diplomatic finesse was in short supply, but the stakes were sky high. So, as you imagine the dense forests as battlegrounds for pelts and power, remember that these wars were more than just about fur. They were about survival, identity, and the fierce competition for control in a changing world. You find yourself in the cold, early dawn of New England in the 1670s, where the air hangs heavy with tension and smoke from smoldering villages. King Philip's War, the bloodiest conflict per capita in American history, unfolds around you. Metacom, known to the English as King Philip, leads a desperate resistance to push back against the ever-encroaching settlers who gobble up native lands and threaten the very survival of his people. You can almost hear the crackle of burning homes and the sharp reports of muskets echoing through dense forests as both sides suffer tremendous losses. This war was brutal but deeply personal. Neighbors turned enemies, alliances shattered, and entire communities uprooted. The indigenous population of New England was decimated, with some tribes nearly wiped off the map. Historians still argue whether King Philip's War could have been avoided through diplomacy, or if the deep-seated mistrust and expansionist hunger made violence inevitable. What's certain is that the war reshaped the region's demographic and political landscape, cementing English dominance for centuries. Here's a quirky fact. During the war, both sides reportedly used fire arrows, arrows tipped with burning material, to ignite enemy settlements. Imagine the eerie glow of flaming arrows streaking across the night sky, like ancient signal fires announcing doom. And speaking of signals, some Native American warriors used drums and coded signals to coordinate surprise attacks, a primitive but effective early warning system that kept their foes on edge. So as you sit quietly in the flickering firelight, think of the lives caught between survival and annihilation, of the fragile line between peace and war that once ran through these forests and fields. This was a conflict that shaped New England's soul, scarred but enduring. The sun hangs low over the dusty trails of the southeast, where Spanish missions dot the landscape like quiet sentinels. You walk among these outposts, churches, forts, and farms, built by Spanish colonizers seeking to spread Christianity and claim territory. But beneath the calm facade, tensions simmer as native groups like the Apalachee, Timucua, and Calusa resist these incursions. The missions weren't just religious centers, they became flashpoints in a prolonged struggle for control. You can almost feel the uneasy quiet before storms of rebellion and unrest. Native peoples, while often adopting certain European customs, fiercely guarded their autonomy. Skirmishes erupted over land, resources, and cultural imposition, with native warriors launching surprise raids on missions and Spanish settlements alike. Historians still debate how much the missions truly benefited the native populations versus how much they served as tools of colonial domination and cultural erasure. What's clear is that resistance was persistent and often brutally suppressed. In a curious twist, some missions included native artisans who blended European and indigenous styles in their crafts, creating unique cultural hybrids, a testament to resilience amid turmoil. Imagine intricate pottery featuring Spanish crosses alongside traditional tribal motifs. And here's a fun, if somewhat strange fact. Spanish soldiers sometimes used war dogs, trained for combat in these frontier conflicts. These fierce animals, part wolf and part mastiff, were terrifying on the battlefield, and added a primal edge to the already volatile encounters. As night falls and the wind carries distant drums and whispered prayers, remember this ongoing clash of worlds. The subtle battles of faith, culture, and survival playing out far from the better-known colonial wars. The Southeast was a crucible where old and new worlds clashed quietly but fiercely. The air is thick with anticipation and gunpowder as you step into the mid-18th century, where the stakes have grown from scattered skirmishes to a full-scale contest for North America itself. The French and Indian War, part of a larger global struggle known as the 7 Years' War, pits Britain against France, with Native American tribes weaving their own complex loyalties into the mix. You trudge alongside colonial militias and seasoned soldiers through dense woods and rocky terrain, every step a calculated risk. This war isn't just about territory, it's about empire, resources, and the future of two mighty nations. The French, with their network of forts stretching from Canada down through the Mississippi Valley, try to hold their ground against an ever-growing British push from the Atlantic coast. Native tribes caught between these giants form alliances that can mean survival or destruction. Historians still argue whether the war's outcome was inevitable, given the demographic and economic advantages of the British colonies. Yet the ferocity of French and Native resistance complicated the conflict, making it a brutal and drawn-out affair. A quirky fact: some Native warriors earned nicknames like Half-King for their diplomatic and military savvy, blurring the lines between tribal leadership and colonial politics. Imagine navigating a world where your allegiance could shift the balance of power overnight. And you might smile at the early British attempts to adapt to wilderness warfare. Some soldiers struggled to master camouflage and guerrilla tactics, sticking out in bright red coats like flamingo at a deer hunt. It took harsh lessons for European troops to learn that fighting in forests was nothing like marching on open fields. So as you listen to the distant echoes of musket fire and war cries mingling in the misty forest, remember that this war was a pivotal chapter shaping the future borders and alliances of North America. It was a conflict that tested endurance, strategy, and loyalties on all sides. You trudge through thick, shadowy forests where conventional European warfare gives way to something far more elusive and unpredictable: guerrilla tactics and wilderness warfare. In this tangled green maze, loud cannon volleys and formal lines of battle are often useless. Instead, stealth, knowledge of the terrain, and surprise reigns supreme. Imagine yourself moving silently beneath towering pines, the crunch of leaves muffled by thick moss, eyes scanning for any flicker of movement. Native warriors excelled in this environment, blending into the forest like ghosts, striking swiftly before vanishing. They used ambushes, hit-and-run raids, and intimate knowledge of waterways and animal trails to outmaneuver larger, less agile European forces. Historians still argue whether European armies ever fully adapted to these unconventional tactics or remained hampered by their traditional military doctrine. It's clear, though, that these forest fights were grueling, psychological battles where fear and uncertainty played as big a role as bullets. On a quirkier note, some Native American fighters used decoys, like setting up fake camps or leaving behind misleading tracks, to confuse and trap their enemies. Picture a bewildered British soldier chasing shadows through the underbrush, utterly lost. And here's a gentle reminder: European soldiers often found themselves ill-prepared for the wilderness, their bright red uniforms making them easy targets. Kind of like wearing a neon sign in a game of hide-and-seek. It took hard lessons and some embarrassing defeats before commanders started considering camouflage and irregular tactics. So, as you imagine yourself crawling through the forest floor, heart-pounding, remember that these battles weren't just physical contests, but intense mental struggles, where every leaf, sound, and shadow could mean life or death. It was a different kind of war, wild and intimate, shaping the fight for North America in ways few expected. You find yourself on the edge of a smoky campfire, the flickering flames casting gentle shadows on tired faces. In the chaos of war, not all battles are fought with muskets and arrows. Women, children, and elders play crucial roles behind the scenes, shaping the course of these early conflicts in ways often overlooked. Their resilience and resourcefulness are the quiet backbone of survival. Imagine women in settler villages tirelessly tending to fields, nursing the wounded, and maintaining households under constant threat of attack. Native women gather food, prepare medicines, and pass down stories and strategies that keep their communities strong. Their hands, scarred or steady, stitch together the torn fabric of life amid uncertainty. Historians still debate how much agency these non-combatants held versus being pawns caught in the tides of war. But the truth is, they were often fierce defenders of their homes and cultures, sometimes even taking up arms when necessary. Here's a quirky detail. Some Native American women were known to wield weapons during skirmishes, such as bows or clubs, surprising European men who underestimated their fierceness. And on the colonial side, some women disguised themselves as men to join militias. Talk about dedication. You might smile at tales of settlers using inventive home defenses, like hanging buckets of tar to pour on intruders or fashioning early warning systems from bells and whistles. These humble strategies often made the difference between life and death. So as you settle by the fire's warmth, remember that war is never just about soldiers in uniform. The fragile hopes for peace in this rugged land often came wrapped in paper and promises, treaties signed and sealed between wary colonial leaders and Native American chiefs. But these agreements, more often than not, carried the bitter taste of broken promises and shifting boundaries. You can almost hear the scratching of quills on parchment, followed by the uneasy silence as one side waits for words to be honored while the other quietly recalculates. Treaty making was a complex dance of diplomacy, deception, and desperation. Some agreements established brief truces or defined territorial lines, but enforcement was a different story. Settlers frequently ignored boundaries, pushing deeper into native lands, while native leaders sometimes felt compelled to agree under pressure or with limited understanding of European legal concepts. Historians still argue whether these treaties could have ever been truly fair or if they were inherently skewed by the colonial powers' hunger for land and control. What remains undeniable is the profound impact these broken promises had on the trust and relationships between peoples. Here's an odd fact. Some treaties included peace medals or gifts meant to symbolize friendship, but these tokens were sometimes seen as bribes or meaningless trinkets by native recipients. Imagine expecting a handshake and getting a shiny coin instead. And in a strange twist, some treaties required native leaders to promise to give up their hunting weapons, or even adopt European dress and customs, early examples of cultural assimilation written into law. As you imagine these dusty rooms where words were exchanged, remember that the paper agreements often papered over deeper conflicts. Peace was fragile, trust scarce, and the cycle of hope and betrayal repeated time and again. The frontier is a restless place, a patchwork of unsettled lands where every sunrise could bring peace or peril. Along these volatile edges, raids became a grim reality, a deadly game of retaliation and survival. You trudge along dirt trails dotted with burned cabins and hastily abandoned farms, where whispers of attacks travel faster than the wind. Settler communities fortified themselves with blockhouses and watchtowers, ever alert for the sudden flash of arrows or the crack of gunfire. Native groups facing encroachment and broken promises launched calculated raids on settlements to reclaim land or resources. These raids sparked cycles of revenge, each side fueling the other's fears and hatred. Historians still debate whether these frontier raids were strategic acts of war or desperate measures born from frustration and displacement. What's clear is the toll they took on families, crops, and the fragile hopes of peaceful coexistence. A quirky detail, some settlers developed early scarecrow devices, not to ward off birds, but to mimic armed guards and deter nighttime attackers. Imagine wooden mannequins in the flickering firelight, standing guard with eerie stillness. On the native side, warriors sometimes used war paint patterns designed to confuse enemies about their numbers or intentions. Shadows moving in the trees could be one fighter or many. It was psychological warfare as much as physical. As you step lightly on these contested borders, remember, that life here was a constant balance between vigilance and exhaustion, courage and fear. The frontier was no place for the faint-hearted, but for those who called it home, it was everything. The constant drumbeat of conflict reshaped not just the borders, but the very fabric of Native American societies. You wander through once thriving villages now reduced in size, their inhabitants forever changed by war, disease, and displacement. Traditions that had been passed down for generations are challenged or lost, and entire cultural practices adapt in response to survival needs. Warfare disrupted hunting cycles, agricultural routines, and social structures. Some tribes consolidated or merged for protection, while others fragmented under pressure. You can almost hear the quiet conversations around fires, stories mourning lost kin and debating how to preserve identity in the face of relentless change. Historians still argue to what extent these changes were forced versus voluntary adaptations. Was cultural loss inevitable? Or could different approaches have saved more of these rich traditions? The answer remains murky in the shadows of history. On a lighter note, some tribes incorporated European goods and ideas into their cultural expressions. Imagine traditional dances performed wearing bright glass bead necklaces alongside ancient feathered regalia. It was a dynamic fusion, a testament to resilience amid upheaval. And here's a curious fact. Some Native communities developed new political confederacies during this period, like the Shawnee forming strategic alliances to resist further encroachment, showing that warfare also sparked innovation and cooperation. As you reflect on these transformations, remember that war's impact went beyond battles. It reached into the heart of identity, shaping the future in ways both tragic and inspiring. The story of these peoples is one of endurance, adaptation, and the persistent hope for renewal. You trudge through the rugged frontier settlements, where colonial militias are taking shape. Not professional armies, but local men called upon to defend their homes. These militias, formed from farmers, tradesmen, and anyone who could hold a musket, are the backbone of early American defense. The line between civilian and soldier blurs here, and you can almost hear the clatter of wooden buckets being used as makeshift drums to rally troops. Unlike European regulars, these militias learned quickly that traditional battlefield formations were less effective against guerrilla tactics. Adaptability was key. Scouting parties, quick raids, and knowledge of the terrain became their weapons. You might smile at the image of a group of colonists trying to march in formation, only to be hilariously outpaced by nimble native warriors disappearing into the woods. Historians still debate the effectiveness of these militias compared to professional soldiers. Some argue their flexibility gave them an edge in frontier warfare, while others point to discipline issues and lack of training as significant drawbacks. Here's a quirky tidbit. Many militia members took their dogs to battle, using them for tracking and even as early warning systems. Imagine a barking dog alerting a sleepy camp to an impending attack. Early security alarms with 4 legs and a tail. You can also sense the growing pride and identity among these militias, planting early seeds of what would become the American spirit of self-reliance and defense. These men were no strangers to hardship, often balancing farm work by day and patrol duty by night. So, as you listen to the steady rhythm of footsteps on dirt roads and the distant calls of sentries, remember that these militias were more than just soldiers. They were neighbors, family, and community defenders, laying groundwork for future American military traditions. You trudge through the scorched earth and shattered forests, left in the wake of endless conflict, where the toll of warfare extends far beyond the battlefield. The land itself bears scars, burned villages, abandoned fields, and polluted streams, and the people carry invisible wounds that run just as deep. The psychological strain of constant fear, loss, and uncertainty hangs heavy, like a thick fog clinging to every settlement. Imagine families waking to silence where neighbors once lived, children growing up with the echo of war drums in their dreams. These early conflicts eroded trust not only between peoples but within communities, as suspicion and trauma spread. Some veterans never found peace, haunted by memories and the weight of survival. Historians still debate how much these psychological and environmental impacts influenced later colonial policies and relationships with native peoples. Was the land's devastation a mere byproduct, or a deliberate tactic in warfare? The answer is complex and unsettling. Here's a quirky fact. Some settlers believed in war sickness, a term for what we might now call PTSD, and sought cures through rituals blending European superstition and native healing practices. Picture a frontier healer mixing herbs while reciting prayers, a blend of desperation and hope. Environmentally, overhunting and deforestation accelerated as war disrupted traditional land use, altering ecosystems in ways that echoed for generations. The wilderness you see isn't quite the same as before the battles began. So, as you breathe in the heavy air, remember that war's damage isn't just counted in lives lost, but in the slow unraveling of nature and the human spirit. These scars shaped the landscape and psyche of early America, reminding us that every battle leaves a lasting mark. You trudge through the echoes of those early battles, the stories weaving together like the rivers carving this vast land. These conflicts, though brutal and heartbreaking, laid the foundations of what would become a new nation. The scars etched into forests, villages, and souls formed a complex legacy, a mix of courage, tragedy, and transformation. The wars and skirmishes forged identities, alliances, and enmities that echoed far beyond their time. Settlers grew accustomed to self-defense and vigilance. Native tribes faced unimaginable challenges yet demonstrated resilience and adaptation, and colonial powers learned hard lessons about the costs of conquest. Historians still argue how much these early conflicts shaped modern America's values and boundaries, but there's no doubt they influenced everything from political attitudes to cultural narratives. The tangled history is a reminder that peace is often fragile, built on a foundation of struggle. Here's a quiet thought. Despite the chaos, moments of unexpected humanity appeared. Truces brokered under starlit skies, shared meals between enemies, and acts of kindness that flickered like lanterns in the dark. These remind us that even in conflict, connection can survive. And as a final quirky note, some veterans of these early wars later became storytellers, their tales passed down through generations, blending history and myth in a way that keeps the past alive, though sometimes with a little embellishment. Like that one time someone swore their musket fired a perfect shot through a spinning log. You can imagine the storyteller winking as the fire crackles, as the night deepens and the soft hum of the world outside settles. Remember, this journey through early America's wars is not just about battles, but about the enduring spirit of people caught in the tides of change. The land and its stories are intertwined, forever shaping each other. Now, as the flickering light fades and the night wraps you in its gentle embrace, let your mind soften. Picture the quiet forests, the slow ripple of rivers, and the calm after storms long past. The echoes of conflict grow distant, replaced by the soothing rhythm of nature's heartbeat. Rest in the knowledge that those who came before faced great trials and yet found ways to endure, to adapt, and to hope. Let their resilience lull you into peaceful dreams, carrying you gently through the night,